Hey, what's up there, YouTubers? Admin sent a job can be you guys here today with another deck. So today we are going to be taking a look at a standard deck, and it is Esper Super Friends. So Esper is a color combination of blue, white, and black, and the Super Friends theme is just a fancy way of saying that it's a control deck that also uses Planeswalkers fairly decently as win conditions. So for this deck, I'm using it in the kind of like the mid-season of the Gatecrash season of Standard, and it's been doing quite well. I also took this deck to the side events at Grand Prix Pittsburgh, and it had really, really good results. So we're going to take a look at it here today. If you guys have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see, please leave them down in the comments below, and I'll take them into consideration for future deck techs. So the first thing, as always, that we're going to take a look at is the land base of the deck. So we're running 26 lands, and we have a lot of dual lands just because this is a 3-color combination deck. So first off, we have Watery Grave as a playset. From there, we have Godless Shrine as a playset as well. Hallowed Fountain as a playset. We have a playset of Drowned Catacomb. 3 Glacial Fortress. 3 Isolated Chapel. And then we have some utility lands for us here. So I'm running 2 Nephalia Drownyard and 2 Ghost Quarter. The Nephalia Drownyard is a win condition for this deck, and a consistent one at that, where we are able to mill out our opponent for 3 mana and tapping the Nephalia Drownyard. Especially against the slower matchups like mid-range and control, it ends up being really good for us, just being able to mill every single turn if nothing else. And with Ghost Quarter, it's mainly for Wolf Run. Wolf Run is a very annoying card, especially in deck variants such as Wolf Run Ban. And being able to blow up a Wolf Run of theirs is definitely going to throw them off of their game. Also, against the mirror match, we're able to get rid of our opponent's Nephalia Drownyards as well, and ensure that they don't have a way of being able to mill us out as well. So 2 Ghost Quarters. So that's the land base, 26 lands here. Now let's take a look at everything else that we have in the deck. So starting off with our creatures in ascending order, we have Snapcaster Mage as a 2-of. So Snapcaster Mage is really important in this deck, just being able to reoccur things. I'm also running one more in the sideboard for the mid-range and the control matchups, just so I can have a more useful time being able to reoccur things like counter spells especially, but not limited to it. There's also other things that I can reoccur. But Snapcaster Mage is really solid. I really like him in the deck, and it's pretty appropriate to have one more in the sideboard just to have a more effective means of being able to reoccur more often. From there, I have Obzedat Ghost Council. So he's a 5/5 for 5, and whenever he enters the battlefield, our opponent's going to lose 2 life and we gain 2 life. At the end of our turn, we can exile him, and at the beginning of our upkeep, then we return him to the battlefield under our control, and he has haste. So Obzedat is really, really strong, just because he is not going to die to sorcery speed removal as long as you exile him. And at the beginning of your upkeep, he comes back each and every single turn until your opponent finds a way to deal with him, and he's also able to swing in. So Obzedat is really, really strong. I love him in the deck, and he ultimately just gets there. So 2 Obzedats. For our Planeswalkers, I'm running 1 Liliana of the Veil to be able to force our opponent to either discard cards or to sack creatures. So the +1 forces all players to discard a card, which for us it's not really that big of a deal. We are running flashback spells like Think Twice and Lingering Souls, so we can actually get value out of discarding cards like that, but more times than none we would be discarding lands, so it's not like a huge big deal for us to discard stuff. We get more value out of making our opponent discard. The -2 forces our opponent to sack a creature, which is another big focal point of Liliana of the Veil. So those are the 2 biggest things, but the -6 lets us separate our opponent's permanents into 2 piles. They get to keep one, the other one has to be sacked. So Liliana is really strong. Then we have Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, so I'm running 2 of him. 4-drop, 3 loyalty Planeswalker, +1 creates 1/1 black. vampire tokens with lifelink, which will help us up against aggro matchups until we can resolve a wrath or something like that. The -2 gives us an emblem where creatures we control get +2/+0, which is a less consistent way of winning the game, but it's still a way of winning the game. Being able to make our creatures bigger, especially if we're going with tokens with like Lingering Soul tokens and the tokens made off of Sorin, and potentially creatures like Snapcaster and Obzedat, we are able to swing in and deal a pretty decent amount of damage, especially with the emblem being out there. So that's definitely something. But the -6 being able to blow up 3 creatures or planeswalkers, they go to the grave and then we get them onto our side of the battlefield is really strong. So I like that about Sorin. I'm also running 1 Gideon Champion of Justice, which is really good up against the control matchup. Any really slow decks are going to find him to be a pretty big nuisance, and they need to deal with him. Each turn, he's able to add more and more loyalty counters to himself. So if your opponent has any creatures out there, it's going to be a little bit quicker for him to be able to build up. But when you get to his -15, you get to exile all other permanents, which is really, really fun to do. I've done it multiple times. And it's a really fun thing to do, and at that point your opponent just scoops because they don't have any lands. They are just going to be playing off of what they have in their hand, and that's really not a whole lot. So Gideon is able to, from that point, just swing in on your opponent if he has enough loyalty counters. If not, he can build himself up a little bit and then just start swinging until you get to lethal. From there we have Tamiyo. So Tamiyo is a singleton as well. However, Tamiyo is very, very good as a 5-drop planeswalker with 4 loyalty. Her +1 lets us tap down a permanent and it doesn't untap, so we're able to do that to our opponent's lands, like if they need double colors, like if they need double blue for a counter spell like Dissipate or something like that, we can keep them off of their mana. We can also start tapping down other things that they have, like utility lands like Nephalia Drownyard or Wolf Run. So it's good for that, but we can also tap down creatures, which is like the most common thing to do. Her -2 lets us draw cards equal to the amount of tapped creatures target player controls, and the -8 gives us an emblem where if cards would be put into our grave, we can put them into our hand instead. So it essentially lets us like reuse spells like Devour Flesh, Azorius Charm, anything like that. So Tamiyo is really solid, and she's a really good planeswalker. From there, moving away from our planeswalkers, we have Sphinx's Revelation, as you guys could imagine, in the Esper colors. So this is a 3-up for us, where we gain X amount of life and draw X amount of cards. I'm also running Azorius Charm in this deck as a playset to be able to bounce target opponent's creature, or if it's a attacking or blocking creature, it could also be ours as well, if we want to get value out of something, which isn't really that common, but I've had it happen if I want to like reoccur Snapcaster into something. But with Azorius Charm, we can return target attacking or blocking creature to the top of its owner's library. From that point, we can also use Nephalia Drownyard, so it's like a 2-part combo where we can essentially get rid of a creature with using Azorius Charm and then milling out our opponent with Nephalia Drownyard. But another thing with Azorius Charm is we can also use the mode to give our creatures lifelink, or we can use the mode to draw cards, so essentially cycle it. All modes are perfectly reasonable and are perfectly usable, but 2 of the modes that are most frequently used are to bounce a creature or to draw a card. I also have 2 Think Twice to be able to draw more, so it's fairly solid for our deck, especially if it's like early on. We're able to draw turn 2, draw turn 3, if not anything else, and Think Twice is a solid way to be able to do that, especially because it allows you to keep mana open where your opponent could think that you have a counterspell or something like that, but in reality, you're just keeping mana open to Think Twice. So it's always nice to have more ways to be able to draw. We are also running 3 Devour Flesh here, so target player sacrifices a creature, then gains life equal to that creature's toughness. So really solid up against the early aggro-based decks. We can just drop it early on, like turn 2, and that's just one less thing that we have to worry about, and we're gonna ultimately take less damage before we hit into a Wrath like Supreme Verdict, and Devour Flesh ultimately is pretty good for letting us stall out. I'm also running 2 Syncopate because Syncopate is really good. Dissipate sometimes gets you into trouble just because it's not fast enough up against like aggro-based decks, and you kind of suffer from that. But Syncopate's really good just because if you're keeping mana open to use something like Devour Flesh on your opponent and they happen to play like Hellrider, they tap 4 for Hellrider, tap out all of their mana, then you can hit Syncopate for just 1 and then still like potentially have mana open for Devour Flesh, hopefully. But Syncopate's really good just because it can be used for aggro-based decks, but it's not limited to it. It still is really good game 1 up against control and mid-range and countering things like Rakdos' Returns, Planeswalkers, other Sphinx's Revelations. There's a lot of stuff that Syncopate can just deal with, so I like to have it as a 2 of. It can be easily reoccurred with Snapcaster Mage as well. From there, I have Lingering Souls as a 3 of, so put 2 1/1s with flying onto the battlefield, and it flashes back for 2. I'm also running 1 Oblivion Ring and 1 Detention Sphere. The Oblivion Ring mainly so I can actually get rid of other Detention Spheres, which is something that I like to do, especially if our opponent gets rid of one of our Planeswalkers, then I can just go ahead and drop Oblivion Ring on their Detention Sphere, get my Planeswalker back, use its ability, and just go off from there. So Oblivion Ring is awesome for that. But the Detention Sphere is just the more like traditional, oh, get rid of all the copies if there are any on the battlefield. And the only bias is it can't get rid of other Detention Spheres. So just 1 ofs for those 2 rather than just running 2 of one or the other. Then I'm running my Wrath effects, so I have Supreme Verdict as a playset to get rid of creatures just because aggro-based decks are quite a nuisance, and being able to have a playset here is very consistent for us. Can't be countered, definitely effective. And then I have 2 Merciless Eviction, so Merciless Eviction is another Wrath effect that I really like to use because it hits into a lot of things. We can exile artifacts if our opponent has Witchbane Orb in games 2 or games 3. We can exile all creatures if our opponent is playing something like Aristocrats and they have Falkenroth Aristocrat, which can give itself indestructible. We can exile all enchantments if our opponent has multiple Detention Spheres, and we can then get back our cards that they exiled. Or we can exile Planeswalkers if our opponent has the upper hand with board state in terms of Planeswalkers. If it's like Garruk and they have a Lily or something like that, if they have more Planeswalkers than us, we can use Merciless Eviction to get rid of those. So Merciless Eviction is really good, and I really like it as a 2 of in the main board to deal with a whole lot of different things. So that is the main board that we have for this deck. Now let's take a look at what we have for the sideboard. Alright, so the first card that we're taking a look at here is Shimmy Inspector, which is a 2/2 for 4 with flying, and he's essentially going to allow us to extirpate our opponent's hand. So whenever he deals combat damage to a player, they are going to have to reveal their hand. We choose a non-land card from it, and we get to search their graveyard, hand, and library for all copies with the same name as that card, and we get to exile them. So Shimmy Inspector, just as a 1 of, is really strong up against the mid-range and the control matchups, just because we can look at their hand and get rid of copies of a card that they could potentially have a lot of value out of playing or keeping in their hand, especially if it's like a counter spell or something like that. I can't even count the amount of times or recall the amount of times where I've played Shimmy Inspector and my opponent has tapped 4 for Supreme Verdict just to get rid of it. Shimmy Inspector being the only creature on the board. It's a really, really powerful card, and nobody wants to allow Shimmy Inspector to hit into them and be able to allow me to look at their hand and get rid of something. It's a really good card. It gives us a lot of really solid value, and it's something that our opponent needs to commit to getting rid of very quickly, and that is also going to allow us to play around and play other things that we could potentially have value out of playing the following turn. So if we play Shimmy Inspector and allow our opponent to just kind of bait into it, where we're just baiting them and forcing them to find a resolution to it and use it, that leaves the opportunity for us to play a Planeswalker or to play something else where we can have a more certain chance of it resolving. So Shimmy Inspector is good for either just bashing our opponent's face or just trying to bait them and get them to use resolution and response cards to be able to get rid of them. I'm also running 1 Jace Memory Adept as A singleton in the sideboard. I don't like him in the main board just because aggro is definitely a thing right now in the meta, and he's really bad up against aggro-based decks. One thing that is kind of a nuisance whenever you start siding him in is your opponent is going to have the initiative to side in Witchbane Orb against this deck just because of Nephalia Drownyard, and they can make the assumption that we also have Jace, that they just didn't see him. But Jace does side in against the slower matchups because we do have Merciless Eviction, we have Detention Sphere and Oblivion Ring that gets rid of Witchbane Orb, and then from that point we can use Jace's ability to mill them out. So Jace is still good in being able to mill out slower based decks. I'm also running one Psychic Spiral up against the mirror matches that are trying to mill us out as well, where we shuffle all cards from our graveyard into our library. Target player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So it lets us reverse the milling effects that our opponent has done onto us. From there, I'm also running 3 Duress, where we get to look at target opponent's hand and we choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, and they have to discard it. Which is good up against the mid-range, like Jund mid-range matchups, the Flash variants, control matchups, anything that runs like a lot of non-creature spells. We are going to be able to get value out of playing Duress, and it's easily flashback with Snapcaster as well. I'm also running 2 Witchbane Orbs myself up against matchups that have the ability to target us with spells. So stuff like Rakdos' Return, Bonfire of the Damned, Liliana of the Veil is another card that targets Jace Memory Adept, Nephalia Drownyard, Slaughter Games. There's a lot of stuff that Witchbane Orbs is just going to allow us to just kind of make null and void. So I like to have 2 of them out there for that. So 2 Witchbane Orb. I'm also running the 1 Snapcaster, like I mentioned before, to be able to reoccur more things in given matchups. 2 Negates to be able to counter non-creature spells, especially stuff like Sphinx's Revelations, Planeswalkers like Garrick, sometimes Liliana if the board state is a little bit awkward for us after she hits the table. Rakdos' Return is another thing that's definitely a nuisance for Control and any other slower decks. So Negate is just there to be able to get rid of any non-creature spells. And then I have Graveyard Hate. I have 4 elements of Graveyard Hate. 2 Purify the Grave and 2 Rest in Peace. For the combo Reanimator decks, like the Human Reanimator decks, I side in all 4 of these elements just to have consistent ways of keeping them from actually being able to combo off. But up against the less traditional Reanimator decks where they are using like Reanimator as a kind of like as a turning point. It's not a win condition for them, but they have Reanimation to be able to reoccur Thragtusk or reoccur Obzedat. Stuff like that. I only side in 3 elements, being like 2 Rest in Peace and 1 Purify the Grave, to be able to combat anything that they're trying to do with their graveyard, especially like Craterhoof Behemoth, where that is a potential win condition for them, but it isn't like a win condition where they combo off and they have this long chain of things that they're doing before they're able to beat us. So 4 elements for combo, 3 elements for just the kind of not combo-oriented Reanimator-based decks. So that is Esper Superfriends and how I've been playing it. So if you guys enjoyed this deck, please be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. The entire deck list is down below where you guys can use it as a reference, as well as a playlist to all the previous decks that I've covered on this channel. So until next time, guys, have yourselves a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day.